"Sir, that's my granddad's signature," the maid's daughter said, and in that instant, the billionaire's jaw dropped, his empire trembling on a single word. The truth doesn't always whisper. It crashes into your life when you least expect it. For Chloe Miller, it came in the form of a blueprint, rolled across a billionaire's table like just another trophy. She was only 10, but her eyes didn't lie. The lines, the strokes, the signature, it was her granddad's. The same man the world said had vanished. The same man everyone told her had given up. "Sir," Chloe's small voice cut through the room. "That's my granddad's signature." For a moment, Preston Hayes, the man the world called a titan, froze. His jaw slackened. His eyes darted to the blueprint in his hand. The same signature a little girl had traced in her grandfather's notebooks 1,000 times. He said it was his design. She said it was a lie. And what started as a child's quiet observation ended as the unraveling of an empire. This is the story of how a missing man's legacy, a little girl's courage, and a mother's strength collided to expose the truth. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A promise whispered in a dusty attic would bring a titan to his knees. 10-year-old Chloe Miller believed her granddad was a hero who had simply lost his way. She was about to find out he had been stolen from the world, and she was the only one who held the key. The Hayes estate was a world of polished silence. It was a sprawling kingdom of marble floors and towering windows that looked out onto an ocean of perfectly manicured green lawn. To 10-year-old Chloe Miller, it smelled like lemons and loneliness. She sat on a small, stiff chair in the cavernous kitchen, her worn sneakers tucked neatly underneath. Her sketchbook was open on her lap, but her pencil was still. She was supposed to be drawing the garden, but her eyes kept drifting to her mother, Jessica. Jessica Miller moved through the grand kitchen with a quiet efficiency that Chloe had come to know as a sign of deep exhaustion. She wiped down a vast granite countertop that gleamed like a frozen lake, her movements precise and automatic. Her brow was furrowed with a worry that never seemed to leave, a constant companion etched in the faint lines around her eyes. Each swipe of her cloth was a small act of defiance against the tidal wave of bills and responsibilities that threatened to pull their small family under. Chloe's world was a universe away from this place. Their apartment was small and warm, smelling of her mom's cinnamon tea and the old books that had belonged to her grandfather. Their life was a carefully balanced equation of rent, groceries, and the constant, unspoken grief for the man who was missing from their lives, Henry Hank Miller. To the world, Hank Miller was a footnote in history, a decorated war veteran, a brilliant but troubled engineer who had vanished a decade ago. The official story, the one Chloe hated with every fiber of her being, was that he had walked away from his life, his car found abandoned by the old quarry. They said a man who could survive a war couldn't survive his own mind. But Chloe knew better. She knew the man who taught her how to tie her shoes by telling her a story about a rabbit and a fox. She knew the man whose deep, rumbling laugh could make the whole apartment shake. And she knew his signature. It was a work of art, a bold, confident script that adorned every birthday card, every silly drawing he'd ever praised, every book he'd ever given her. It was the signature of a hero, not a ghost. "Chloe, honey, stay right here for a few minutes," Jessica said, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Hayes is having a meeting in the study. I need to bring in the coffee service. Do not wander off, you hear me?" "Yes, Mom," Chloe whispered, finally putting her pencil to the paper. She sketched a bird on a branch, its wings spread as if about to take flight. A deep, commanding voice boomed from the hallway, growing closer. "The beauty of the Odyssey engine isn't its power, gentlemen. It's its efficiency. It will redefine global logistics. It will make us gods of commerce." The kitchen door swung open. In walked Preston Hayes, a man who looked like he had been carved from granite and dressed in a suit that cost more than their car. He was tall and imposing, with a mane of silver hair and eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He wasn't just rich. He was a force of nature, a titan of industry whose face was a permanent fixture on financial news channels. Following him were two other men in dark suits, their expressions a mixture of awe and intimidation. Jessica froze for a second, her hands tightening on the silver coffee pot. She offered a small, almost invisible nod. Mr. Hayes. Hayes didn't look at her. His gaze swept over her as if she were another piece of furniture. His eyes, however, did land on Chloe. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He hated complications, and a child in his kitchen was a complication. Jessica, what is this? He asked, his voice dangerously smooth. My apologies, sir. My sitter canceled last minute. She's being perfectly quiet, Jessica said, her voice trembling slightly. She won't be a bother. Hayes let out an impatient sigh and turned his attention to his guests. As I was saying, before we discuss the future, let me show you the past. The very spark of the idea. He strode over to a large mahogany table in the center of the kitchen, the one usually reserved for flower arrangements. He unrolled a long, yellow document from a leather tube. It was a technical blueprint, covered in complex equations and a beautifully detailed schematic of an engine. It was a masterpiece of engineering. The original draft, Hayes announced, his voice filled with pride. Drawn by my own hand nearly 15 years ago. A moment of inspiration that built a billion-dollar reality. His guests murmured their appreciation. But Chloe wasn't looking at them. She had stood up from her chair, her sketchbook forgotten on the floor. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She recognized the drawing. It was hauntingly familiar, almost identical to the sketches in her granddad's old notebooks that she spent hours looking through in their attic. Her eyes moved from the complex diagrams to the bottom right-hand corner of the blueprint. There, next to a faded date, was the signature. The bold, confident script. The grand, looping H. The strong, decisive M. Time seemed to slow down. The hum of the refrigerator faded away. The weight of the air in the room felt immense. It was a signature she had traced with her own small finger 1,000 times. It was the signature on the last letter he ever sent, the one that said, "Be good for your mom, little star. I'm on the verge of something big." It was the signature of Henry Hank Miller. A cold, clear certainty washed over her, silencing the fear that was telling her to stay quiet. This man was a liar. He had not just stolen an idea, he had stolen her grandfather's name. Her voice, when it came out, was not the timid whisper of a 10-year-old girl. It was clear and steady, cutting through the self-satisfied murmurs of the men. "Sir," she said, her eyes locked on Preston Hayes. "That's my granddad's signature." Preston Hayes froze. His self-assured smile vanished, replaced by a canvas of pure, unguarded shock. It wasn't just surprise. It was the primal fear of a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a solid wall. The smug mask he wore for the world dissolved, revealing something ugly and cornered underneath. He stared at the small, blonde girl as if she had just spoken in a forgotten language, a language only he could understand. What did you say?" he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. His eyes darted from Chloe's determined face to the signature on the page, and back again. Jessica rushed forward, her face pale with terror. "Chloe, hush. I am so sorry, Mr. Hayes. She doesn't know what she's saying. She has a wild imagination." She put a trembling hand on Chloe's shoulder, trying to pull her back. But Chloe stood her ground. She pointed a small, steady finger at the blueprint. "His name. Henry Miller. That's my grandfather. He drew that." The name hit Hayes like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, chalky white beneath his expensive tan. Henry Miller. A name he had buried under 2 decades of lies and money. A ghost he thought he had exorcised forever. The two investors looked on, utterly bewildered. The placid atmosphere of their business meeting had been shattered by the clear, accusing voice of a child. Hayes's shock was rapidly being replaced by a frantic, cornered animal fury. He hastily rolled up the schematic, his hands fumbling with the leather tube. "That's preposterous," he boomed, his voice regaining its force but now laced with a brittle, defensive anger. "Jessica, get this delusional child out of here." "Now, I'm not delusional." Chloe's voice rose to match his, ringing with a conviction that startled everyone in the room. He called it Project Odyssey. He wrote about it in his notebooks. He said it would change the world. The name of the project was the second blow. Hayes staggered back a step, his composure completely shattered. He looked at Jessica, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You will leave this house immediately. You are fired. And you will never speak of this again." "Sir, please, it's just a misunderstanding," Jessica pleaded, tears welling in her eyes as she pulled a distraught Chloe towards the door. The life she had so carefully held together was unraveling. "There is no misunderstanding," Hayes snarled, his voice low and venomous. He took a step towards them, towering over Jessica and Chloe, his presence filling the room with menace. "Security will see you out. If you ever set foot on this property again, I will have you arrested. If you breathe a word of this fantasy to anyone, I will personally see to it that you have nothing. Do you understand me?" The promise was not just a threat, it was a curse. It spoke of a power that could erase people, a power he had clearly used before. Jessica, her body shaking with fear and humiliation, simply nodded. She grabbed Chloe's hand and practically dragged her out of the kitchen, past two stern-faced security guards who had appeared as if from nowhere. Chloe looked back one last time. The fear on Preston Hayes' face was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian mask of controlled fury. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw a silent, brutal promise. "I will destroy you for this." The heavy oak door of the service entrance clicked shut behind them, cutting them off from the world of lemon-scented polish and cruel lies. They stood in the driveway under the afternoon sun, the gravel crunching under their feet. Jessica finally let the tears fall, deep, racking sobs of a mother who had just lost everything. Her job, their stability, their fragile peace, all gone. Chloe stood beside her, silent. The shame of seeing her mother cry was a heavy weight in her chest. But beneath the shame, a new feeling was taking root. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard resolve. Preston Hayes wasn't just a liar and a thief. His reaction had been one of pure, animal guilt. He was hiding something much, much darker than a stolen invention. He hadn't just stolen her grandfather's work. He knew what happened to him. The bus ride home was a blur of passing streets and her mother's silent tears. The weight of what had happened pressed down on Chloe, a physical ache in her small body. No job, a powerful enemy, a terrifying secret. It felt impossible. When they finally crept into their small, familiar apartment, the silence was deafening. Jessica sank onto the worn sofa, her head in her hands. "What have you done, Chloe? What were you thinking?" she whispered, her voice thick with despair. "We have nothing now." Chloe walked over and stood in front of her mother. She waited until Jessica looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "He's lying, Mom," Chloe said, her own voice trembling but clear. "And he's scared. We saw it. You saw it, right?" Jessica looked at her daughter's face, at the fierce determination in her blue eyes, and saw the echo of a man she hadn't seen in 10 years. She saw her father's unwavering spirit. The despair began to recede, replaced by a flicker of the fight she thought she had lost long ago. "Yes," Jessica whispered, a new strength in her voice. "I saw it. Granddad's things are in the attic," Chloe said, her mind already racing. "All his notebooks. Maybe there's proof." Fueled by a surge of adrenaline that pushed back their exhaustion and fear, they went to the hall closet. Jessica pulled the string for the attic stairs, the rickety wooden steps groaning in protest as they ascended into the cold, dusty space. The attic was a museum of their former life, filled with boxes of things Jessica couldn't bear to part with after her father disappeared. It smelled of old paper, cedar, and forgotten memories. Under a single bare light bulb, they began their search. They sifted through boxes of old photographs, holiday decorations, and Chloe's childhood drawings. And then they found it. A heavy-duty footlocker, the kind soldiers use, with H. Miller stenciled in white on the side. Jessica's breath hitched. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside was his life's work. Dozens of spiral-bound notebooks filled with his dense, intricate handwriting. Page after page of equations, theories, and diagrams. They spent hours on the dusty floor, a mother and daughter unearthing a lost legacy. They found early drafts of the Odyssey engine, with notes scribbled in the margins. One read, "PH thinks the fuel consumption is a dead end. He has no vision. I know this will work. PH Preston Hayes." Deeper in the trunk, tucked inside a worn copy of Moby Dick, they found a manila folder. It contained not schematics, but photographs and a single, folded legal document. The first photo made Jessica gasp. There was her father, 20 years younger, his arms slung around a much younger, thinner Preston Hayes. They were standing outside a drab industrial building with a sign that read Miller Hayes Innovations. They looked like partners. Friends. This betrayal was deeper, more personal than they could have imagined. The last item was the document. It was a carbon copy of a legal agreement, a partnership dissolution. It was dated just 3 weeks before Hank Miller disappeared. According to the dense legal text, Henry Miller was relinquishing all claims to their shared intellectual property, specifically Project Odyssey, in exchange for a shockingly small sum. The document cited Mr. Miller's increasingly erratic behavior and mental instability as the reason for the dissolution. But the most chilling part was the signature at the bottom. It was her father's name, but the signature was a clumsy, pathetic forgery. The bold, looping H was cramped and hesitant. The strong M was shaky. It looked nothing like the confident signature on the blueprint Hayes had shown off, and nothing like the thousands of examples in the notebooks surrounding them. This was it. The smoking gun. He faked it, Jessica whispered, her voice filled with a horrifying clarity. He forged this document to steal everything. He painted your granddad as unstable to discredit him. A cold dread washed over them. The story of a hero's quiet suicide suddenly seemed far more sinister. A man about to be robbed of his legacy, his reputation destroyed by his partner. Would he simply walk away? Or would he fight back? And what would a ruthless man like Preston Hayes do to someone who stood in the way of a billion-dollar empire? The thought was so terrifying it made the dusty air in the attic feel thick and hard to breathe. He hadn't just erased her father's name from an invention. He had erased her father. Jessica carefully gathered the forged document, the photograph, and one of the notebooks containing the earliest Project Odyssey designs. The dust of the attic no longer felt like the dust of the dead. It felt like gunpowder. For 10 years, they had been victims, adrift in a sea of grief and unanswered questions. Now, they had evidence. They had a direction. And they had an enemy. As the first gray light of dawn broke through the small attic window, a profound shift had occurred. The fear was still there, a cold knot in their stomachs. But it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. Jessica looked at Chloe, at her daughter who had, in one brave moment, reignited a decade-old fight. They were no longer just fighting for the memory of a great man. They were fighting for his life. They had to prove he didn't sign that paper, that he didn't just disappear. They had to find out what really happened 10 years ago, and they knew they couldn't do it alone. Jessica knew their next step couldn't be the police. It would be their word, the word of a fired maid and her 10-year-old daughter, against one of the most powerful and respected men in the country. They would be dismissed as disgruntled, their evidence brushed aside as a pathetic attempt at a shakedown. They needed an ally, someone who wasn't afraid of Preston Hayes, someone who already knew how to fight giants. She spent the next day at the public library, with Chloe sitting quietly beside her, drawing in her sketchbook. Using the library's computers, Jessica dug into Preston Hayes' past, searching for any hint of controversy, any crack in his perfect public facade. For a man of his stature, his record was suspiciously clean. It was as if any potential problem had been scrubbed from existence before it could ever take root. But Jessica was persistent. She dove deeper into archived news sites from 6 or 7 years ago, using search terms from her father's notebooks. That's when she found a name, David Chun. 6 years ago, David Chun had been an investigative journalist for a major national newspaper, a rising star known for his relentless pursuit of truth in the face of corporate power. And he had set his sights on Preston Hayes. He published a series of articles hinting at irregularities in the founding of Hayes Industries, questioning the official timeline of the Odyssey engine's development. He cited anonymous sources who spoke of a shadow partner, a brilliant engineer who had been cheated and forced out in the company's early days. The blowback had been immediate and catastrophic. Hayes Industries launched a ruthless, multi-million-dollar lawsuit against both Chun and the newspaper, accusing them of defamation. A brutal smear campaign was launched, painting David Chun as a reckless and unstable reporter who fabricated sources to make a name for himself. His anonymous sources, facing immense pressure and likely offered hefty payouts, recanted their stories one by one. The newspaper, staring down a legal battle that threatened to bankrupt them, buckled. They settled out of court, fired David Chun, and issued a full, public retraction of his articles. In the space of a month, David Chun went from being a celebrated journalist to a professional pariah. He had touched the sun and been burned to ashes. Jessica found his current whereabouts through a small, independent news blog he now ran from his apartment. It was a shadow of his former work, a cynical and rambling platform where he mostly wrote about local politics. He was a wounded lion, still roaring, but from the confines of a cage he couldn't escape. He was perfect. His address was in a gritty, industrial part of the city. The apartment building was a walk-up with peeling paint and a lingering smell of damp concrete. Holding Chloe's hand tightly, Jessica knocked on the door of apartment 4B. The man who answered was not what she expected. He was younger than his old byline photo suggested, maybe in his late 30s, with tired eyes that still held a spark of weary intelligence. His hair was unkempt, he needed a shave, and his t-shirt was stained with coffee. "Yeah," he asked, his voice gravelly. "Are you David Chen?" Jessica asked, her heart pounding. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression a mixture of suspicion and profound boredom. "Depends. If you're selling something, I'm not buying. If you're serving papers, just leave them on the mat." "My name is Jessica Miller," she said, her voice steady. "This is my daughter, Chloe. I read your articles about Preston Hayes. The ones from 6 years ago." His eyes narrowed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flash of something sharp and painful, like a half-healed wound being poked. "Ancient history, lady. I was wrong. The paper said so. The whole world said so. Now, if you'll excuse me." He started to close the door. "Wait," Chloe's small voice piped up. She stepped forward from behind her mother. "You weren't wrong. You were right. You just didn't have the proof." David Chen paused, the door halfway closed. He looked down at the serious little girl, then back at her mother. He saw not a fanatic or a crank, but a woman and a child with a desperate, burning earnestness in their eyes. He let out a long sigh, a sound of profound weariness that seemed to come from the very bottom of his soul. He opened the door wider. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, gesturing them inside. "Then I'm kicking you out." His apartment was a chaotic mess. Books and old newspapers were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. A massive whiteboard covered in diagrams, newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes dominated one wall, all connected by a tangled web of red string. It was the lair of a man obsessed. And in the very center of it all, like a malevolent spider, was a photograph of Preston Hayes. "You're still investigating him?" Jessica asked, a statement, not a question. "Let's call it a hobby," David muttered, clearing a pile of magazines off a rickety chair so Jessica could sit. "Like building ships in a bottle. Pointless, but it passes the time. So what's your story? Did Hayes's new factory pollute your drinking water? Did one of his automated trucks run over your cat?" Jessica ignored his cynicism. She walked straight to his Hayes-centric whiteboard. From her tote bag, she pulled out the items they had found in the attic. First, she pinned up the photograph of her young father standing beside a young Preston Hayes. David's eyes widened slightly. "Who's the other guy?" "My father," Jessica said. "Henry Miller." Next, she pinned the forged partnership dissolution agreement next to the photo. "And this is the document Hayes used to steal my father's life's work. He disappeared 10 years ago. 3 weeks after this was supposedly signed." Finally, she looked at David, her eyes pleading. 2 days ago, my daughter and I were in his house. He was showing off the original blueprint for the Odyssey engine. It had my father's real signature on it. My daughter, she called him out on it. He fired me on the spot." David was silent for a long moment. He walked over to the board, his journalistic instincts kicking in despite himself. He picked up the photograph, studying the faces of the 2 young men, so full of hope and ambition. He peered at the crude signature on the document, his trained eye immediately seeing the telltale signs of a forgery, the inconsistent pressure, the hesitation in the strokes that tried to mimic a natural flow. He looked at the woman and child standing in his living room, who had risked everything they had to confront a titan. Then his eyes landed on a name he had scrawled on the whiteboard years ago, with a question mark next to it. It was a tidbit from one of his sources who had later recanted. "Project Odyssey. That was your father's name for it," he said softly, a statement of dawning realization. "Yes," Jessica whispered. David finally turned to face them. For the first time, the weary cynicism in his eyes was gone. In its place was the ghost of the crusading reporter he used to be. The fire wasn't out. It had just been banked, waiting for fuel. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Do you have any idea what you've stumbled into? This isn't just about a stolen patent. A man like Preston Hayes doesn't build a global empire and leave loose ends. If your father didn't sign that paper, and then he conveniently disappears, I don't think he's dead, Jessica said, the words she'd barely dared to think now spoken aloud. I think Hayes did something to him. I think he's hiding him somewhere. David stared at her, then at his board, at the web of lies and power he had been trying to untangle for 6 agonizing years. He had been missing the key. He had the smoke, but never the gun. He had the whispers, but never the victim. And now they were standing in his apartment. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a chance at redemption. His own, and Henry Miller's. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Okay, Jessica Miller, he said, then looked down at Chloe. Okay, Chloe Miller. You've got my attention. He ripped a half-dozen old articles off the whiteboard, clearing a space in the center. Let's go hunting. David Chin's apartment, once a tomb of forgotten ambition, became a bustling war room. The whiteboard was wiped clean of its old, cynical scribbles and was now methodically organized. At the center was the photograph of Henry Miller and Preston Hayes. Around it, David began to build a timeline, a spiderweb of connections, and a list of questions. Okay, David said, pacing in front of the board, a half-eaten bag of pretzels in his hand. He was a different man now. The weary cynicism had been burned away by a renewed sense of purpose. Hayes has power, money, and a 20-year head start. We have this. He gestured to the small pile of evidence on his coffee table. A forged document, a picture, and a set of notebooks. It's not enough to go to the authorities, but it's enough to start pulling on a thread. For the next week, they worked relentlessly. During the day, Jessica searched for a new job, facing a string of rejections that all felt suspiciously similar. It seemed Preston Hayes' threat was not an empty one. His influence reached further than she could have imagined. In the evenings, she would join David, poring over her father's notebooks. Chloe was always there, a quiet, observant presence. She would sit at the kitchen table, supposedly doing her homework, but her eyes were always on the whiteboard, her ears tuned to every word. The notebooks were a goldmine, but not in the way they expected. They were filled with complex physics and engineering, most of which was indecipherable to Jessica and David. But scattered among the equations were personal notes, fragments of a brilliant mind at work. Listen to this, Jessica said one evening, her finger tracing a line of neat script. October 12th. Preston wants to bring in military investors. I told him no. Odyssey is for the people. It's about clean energy, not smarter bombs. He looked at me like I was a fool. David scribbled furiously on the whiteboard. Motive, he muttered. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the application. Hayes wanted to sell it to the highest bidder, no matter their intentions. Your father was the moral obstacle. Chloe, who had been quietly sketching, piped up. Granddad used to say that every invention has a soul. You have to make sure it's a good one. David and Jessica looked at her. Her simple, profound statement hung in the air. She wasn't just a child caught in the middle of this. She was the keeper of her grandfather's conscience. David decided their first move had to be to verify the forgery. He had a contact, a man named Arthur Kendrick, a forensic document examiner who owed him a favor from his old reporting days. Kendrick was a reclusive genius, a man who lived and breathed paper, ink, and the secrets they held. The meeting was arranged in a dusty, dimly lit office above a used bookstore. The place smelled of aging paper and chemical solvents. Arthur Kendrick was a small, bird-like man with thick glasses that magnified his intense, curious eyes. He looked at the partnership dissolution document under a microscope, his silence stretching for an uncomfortably long time. This is a very good fake, he finally said, his voice a dry rustle. The forger knew your father's handwriting. They practiced. See here. He pointed to a spot on the paper with a pair of tweezers. The hesitation in the upstroke of the M. And the ink, it's been artificially aged. But the chemical signature is wrong for a document from this period. It's clever, but it's a lie. He then took out one of Hank's notebooks and compared the signatures. There's no question. The one on this legal form is a forgery. He handed them a signed, notarized affidavit of his findings. It was their first concrete piece of ammunition. Meanwhile, Preston Hayes was not idle. The confrontation in his kitchen had rattled him to his core. For 20 years, the ghost of Henry Miller had been silent. Now, it was speaking through the mouth of a 10-year-old girl. He had his head of security, a ruthless and discreet man named Gavin, run a thorough background check on Jessica Miller. Gavin's report landed on Hayes's desk 2 days later. It detailed Jessica's life, her financial struggles, and her father's disappearance. But the last page was the one that made Hayes's blood run cold. It was a grainy surveillance photo of Jessica and Chloe entering a rundown apartment building. The same building where David Chun lived. Chun. Hayes spat the name like a curse. The reporter he had crushed 6 years ago was back. This wasn't a coincidence. The maid's daughter hadn't just had a random memory. This was an attack. They were digging. Hayes's paranoia, the very trait that had helped him build his empire, kicked into high gear. He saw conspiracies in every shadow. He ordered Gavin to put a tail on Jessica and David. Every phone call was to be monitored, every meeting recorded. He needed to know what they knew and what they were planning. The pressure began to mount. One evening, as David was walking back to his apartment, a large, dark sedan swerved to the curb, and 2 imposing men in suits got out. They didn't threaten him physically. Their attack was more insidious. "Mr. Chun," the first man said, his voice a polite monotone. "Mr. Hayes is aware of your renewed interest in his business. He considers it a form of harassment. He also knows about your association with the Miller family. He wants to offer you a warning, as a courtesy." "I'm not interested in warnings," David said, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "You should be," the second man said. "A man in your position, a journalist with a history of discredited stories. It would be a shame if certain personal details about your past were to find their way into the public eye. The debts, the gambling problem you worked so hard to overcome. People might think you're a man who could be paid to create a story." They got back in their car and drove off, leaving David standing on the sidewalk, a cold sweat on his brow. The message was clear: we can destroy you again, and this time, it will be permanent. That night, for the first time, doubt crept into David's mind. He had been ruined once. Did he have the strength to go through it again? He looked at his whiteboard, at the hopeful face of Henry Miller in the photograph. He thought of Chloe's unwavering belief in her grandfather. He couldn't back down. This was bigger than his own reputation. The trio realized they needed to find people who had known both Hayes and Miller back when they were partners. Most of the early employees of Miller Hayes Innovations had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Their silence bought and paid for long ago. But there had to be someone. Chloe, once again, provided the key. She was looking through a box of her grandfather's old things and found a small, worn address book. And it was a name, Eleanor Vance. Next to the name was a note. "Ellie, the best damn machinist in the state. And the only one who can stand Preston's coffee." A quick search revealed that an Eleanor Vance owned a small, high-end metal fabrication shop on the industrial outskirts of town. When they arrived, they found a woman in her late 60s, her gray hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her hands stained with grease. She was tough, sharp, and had an air of no-nonsense authority. When Jessica mentioned Henry Miller, Eleanor's guarded expression softened. "Hank," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that spanned the decades. Now there was a man, a true genius, the kindest soul you'd ever meet. And that partner of his, Preston Hayes, a snake in a suit, if ever there was one. I always knew he was no good. They sat in her small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of machine oil. Jessica laid out the story, showing her the forged document and the photograph. Eleanor stared at the forgery, her lips tightening into a thin, angry line. "I'm not surprised," she said. Preston was always jealous of Hank. Hank had the brains, the vision. Preston just had the ambition. He was a shark who smelled blood in the water. Eleanor told them about the final weeks at Miller Hayes Innovations. She described how Preston began to isolate Hank, canceling his meetings, misrepresenting his data to potential investors, and spreading rumors about his mental state. He was gaslighting him, Eleanor said, her eyes flashing with anger. Telling people Hank was becoming unstable, paranoid. But Hank wasn't paranoid. He was just starting to see the snake for what it was. The last time I saw him, he told me he was going to confront Preston. He said he had proof that Preston was trying to steal the company. He looked scared, but determined. He never came back to the shop after that. Then, Eleanor gave them their next lead. The most critical one yet. Hank was a brilliant engineer, but he was also meticulous. He was worried about Preston. He started making backups of all his research, storing them off-site. He was always talking about a place, the safe place where he could work without anyone looking over his shoulder. He called it his sanctuary. He had a cabin somewhere, up by Black Creek Lake. Black Creek Lake, a remote, sparsely populated area 2 hours north of the city. A place where a man could easily disappear, or be made to disappear. As Jessica, Chloe, and David drove away from the machine shop, a black sedan that had been parked a block away pulled out and followed them at a discreet distance. Inside, Gavin, Hayes' head of security, spoke quietly into his phone. They met with Eleanor Vance, he reported to Preston Hayes. And I think I know where they're heading next. Black Creek Lake. On the other end of the line, there was a long, heavy silence. When Hayes finally spoke, his voice was as cold and empty as a winter tomb. Then you know what you have to do, he said. No more warnings. No more loose ends. End it. The drive up to Black Creek Lake was filled with a nervous energy. They were close to something. They could all feel it. The landscape changed from urban sprawl to winding country roads, flanked by dense forests. The air grew crisp and cool. Chloe sat in the back, unusually quiet, her sketchbook open but her hands still. She was tracing the outline of her grandfather's face from an old photo. David drove, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The threat from Hayes' men had been a wake-up call. They weren't just fighting a legal battle anymore. They were in a real, physical danger. Eleanor had given them a hand-drawn map. The cabin wasn't on any official road. It was accessible only by a narrow, overgrown dirt track. After a jarring, bumpy ride, they found it. Tucked away in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees, was a small, rustic cabin. It was weathered and neglected, but still standing. The front door was locked. David, using a tire iron from the trunk, carefully pried it open. The air inside was stale and musty, thick with the dust of a decade. It was like stepping into a time capsule. The main room was a combination living area and workshop. A thick layer of dust covered a simple cot, a wooden table, and a cold, empty fireplace. But one wall was covered in corkboards, and on them was a breathtaking display. Schematics, equations, and notes, all in Henry Miller's familiar handwriting. It was a more advanced, more refined version of the Odyssey engine. He had continued his work here, but there was no sign of him, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished from the room. He was here, Jessica whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She ran a hand over a dusty table, leaving a clean streak. Look, Chloe said, her voice small. She was pointing to the floor. Near the fireplace, almost invisible under the layer of dust, were faint, dark stains on the wooden floorboards. Stains that looked disturbingly like old, dried blood. A cold dread washed over them. This sanctuary wasn't a place of peaceful work. It was a crime scene. As David knelt down to examine the stains more closely, a floorboard creaked behind them. They all spun around. Standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit, were the two men in suits from the dark sedan. This time, their expressions were not polite or menacing. They were cold and empty. And in their hands, they held guns, fitted with silencers. The lead man gave them a thin, chilling smile. Mr. Hayes sends his regards, he said. He's very sorry, but he can't allow you to leave this cabin. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own ragged breathing. The two men stood like statues of doom. The black circles of the silencers pointed directly at them. There was no negotiation in their eyes, no hesitation. They were here to do a job, to erase a problem. Jessica instinctively pulled Chloe behind her, shielding her small body with her own. Her mind, which had been so sharp and focused for the past week, was now a vortex of pure, primal fear. This was it. This was how it ended. They had found the truth, and the truth was a loaded gun. David, however, forced his mind to work. His reporter's brain, trained to observe details under pressure, scanned the room, searching for an exit, a weapon, anything. The door was blocked. The windows were small and grimy. The only other object of note was the large, stone fireplace. It was cold, dark, and offered no escape. Please, Jessica's voice trembled. Don't do this. We won't say anything. We'll go away. I swear. The lead man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. I believe you would, ma'am. But Mr. Hayes isn't a man who likes to take chances. He took a step forward. The second man moved to flank them, cutting off any potential move towards the back of the cabin. They were being herded, like animals for the slaughter. It was then that Chloe, peeking out from behind her mother's legs, noticed something. Her eyes, not clouded by the same adult terror, were drawn to the fireplace. Her grandfather had loved puzzles and secret things. He had built her a puzzle box once with a hidden compartment for her favorite marble. He always said to look for the thing that doesn't fit. And on the stone hearth, one of the flat, gray stones was different. It was a slightly lighter shade, and it had a small, almost invisible carving on it. A star. The same little star her granddad always drew next to her name on her birthday cards. Her heart hammering, she tugged on her mother's jeans. "Mom," she whispered, her voice a tiny thread of sound. The fireplace. The star. Jessica, her mind locked in terror, barely registered the words. But David heard them. His eyes darted to the hearth. He saw the differently colored stone. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all they had. He had to create a diversion. "So this is it," David said, his voice surprisingly loud in the tense silence. He took a half step forward, drawing the men's attention to him. "Hayes is so scared of a ghost that he sends 2 thugs to murder a woman and a child? What happens when we don't come back? People know we came here. People know we were investigating him. This won't bury the story. It will be the story." The lead thug's eyes narrowed. "You talk too much." But David's words had bought them a few precious seconds. While the men were focused on him, Jessica, understanding Chloe's desperate whisper, glanced down at the hearth. She saw the star. It had to mean something. She reached her foot back, her heel pressing down hard on the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low grinding sound of stone on stone, a section of the fireplace's rear wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A hidden passage. The sound, though quiet, was enough. The 2 men spun around, their eyes widening in surprise as they saw the opening. The lead thug raised his gun, his brief hesitation gone, replaced by cold resolve. "No one's going anywhere," he shouted. But it was too late. David acted on pure instinct. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace stand and hurled it at the man, a desperate, clumsy throw. It wasn't aimed to injure, but to distract. It clanged loudly against the stone wall, inches from the man's head. The thug flinched, a fatal, split-second reaction. "Go!" David screamed. He shoved Jessica and Chloe towards the opening. "Go now." Jessica didn't hesitate. She pushed Chloe into the darkness and scrambled in after her. The passage was tight and smelled of damp earth and cold stone. It was pitch black. David lunged for the opening, but one of the men was on him. A powerful arm wrapped around his neck, pulling him back. The other man raised his gun, the silencer aimed squarely at David's chest. From inside the passage, Jessica watched in horror. They couldn't just leave him. But going back was a death sentence. Suddenly, from deep within the darkness of the passage, a voice echoed, a voice they had not heard in 10 years. It was weak, raspy, and frail, but it was unmistakable. "Get down." The command was so unexpected, so impossible, that for a second, everyone froze. Then, a section of the floorboards in the cabin gave way. With a loud crack of splintering wood, a heavy log, rigged as a deadfall trap, swung down from the ceiling. It struck the man aiming his gun at David, sending him crashing to the floor, his weapon skittering away into a corner. The second man, the one holding David, stared in disbelief. That moment of shock was all David needed. He stomped down hard on the man's instep and drove his elbow back into his gut. The man grunted, his grip loosening just enough for David to break free. David didn't wait. He dove headfirst into the hidden passage, scrambling into the darkness. Behind him, he heard a string of curses and the sound of the remaining man helping his partner to his feet. "Don't let them get away," one of them yelled. Jessica grabbed David's arm, pulling him deeper into the tunnel. "This way," she urged, following the faint sound of movement ahead of them. Chloe was already several feet ahead, moving towards a tiny pinprick of light. They stumbled out of the tunnel into a small, hidden cellar. It was damp and cold, lit by a single, bare bulb hanging from a wire. In the center of the room was a small cot, a table littered with empty cans of food, and a stack of books. And sitting on the edge of the cot, looking at them with eyes that were a mixture of shock, confusion, and overwhelming relief, was Hank Miller. He was a ghost of the man from the photographs. His hair was completely white, his beard long and unkempt. He was painfully thin, his skin pale from lack of sunlight. He wore ragged clothes, but his eyes, though haunted, were the same sharp, intelligent eyes that Jessica remembered from her childhood. "Dad," Jessica whispered, the word a fragile thing she was almost afraid to speak. Tears streamed down Hank's face. "Jessica," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He looked at the small girl standing beside her, her blonde hair catching the light of the single bulb. "Chloe, my little star." The reunion was a collision of a decade of pain and longing. Jessica rushed to her father, wrapping her arms around his frail frame, sobbing into his shoulder. Chloe stood back for a moment, her 10-year-old mind struggling to reconcile the vibrant hero from her memories with this thin, broken man. Then she ran to him, burying her face in his side. David Chun stood by the entrance to the tunnel, his heart pounding. He was witnessing a miracle, but he knew they were still in mortal danger. He could hear the men in the cabin above, shouting and searching for the trigger to the passage. "We have to go," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "They'll find this place." Hank nodded, his mind slowly coming back to the present. He looked at his daughter, his granddaughter, and the stranger who had brought them to him. "There's another way out," he said, pointing to a small, heavy wooden hatch in the far corner of the cellar. "It leads out to the old well, 100 yards from the cabin." It was a struggle to get the heavy hatch open. As they finally pushed it aside, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading up into the darkness, they heard a loud crash from the cabin above. Their pursuers had found the entrance to the tunnel. There was no time for explanations, no time for a decade of questions. They scrambled up the steps, emerging into the cool night air at the bottom of a dry, stone-lined well. An old, rusted ladder was bolted to the side. One by one, they climbed out, Hank moving slowly, his body weak from years of confinement. As they slipped into the dark cover of the forest, none of them looked back at the cabin. They were running not just from the men with guns, but from a tomb that had held their family captive for 10 long years. The drive back to the city was a strange mix of adrenaline, exhaustion, and quiet disbelief. Hank sat in the back, wrapped in a blanket, with Chloe nestled beside him, her hand never leaving his. He drank a bottle of water in slow, measured sips, as if his body had forgotten the simple act of hydration. He told them the story in short, fragmented pieces, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. 10 years ago, he had confronted Preston Hayes. He had discovered that Hayes was secretly trying to sell the Odyssey engine designs to a foreign military contractor, a direct betrayal of everything Hank stood for. He told Hayes he was going to expose him. That night, Hayes's men came for him. They didn't kill him. Killing a man leaves a body, an investigation. Hayes had a crueler, more creative plan. He used the partnership dissolution document he had forced Hank to sign, under duress, with his family threatened, to legally erase him from the company. Then, he staged Hank's disappearance, making it look like a suicide. But he couldn't bring himself to kill his old partner. Instead, he imprisoned him. The cabin at Black Creek Lake became Hank's jail. Once a month, a man would come to drop off food and supplies, never speaking a word. Hayes's message was clear: your family is safe, as long as you remain a ghost. You will live out your days here, and the world will forget you ever existed. The deadfall trap and the escape tunnel were things Hank had built himself over the years, scavenging materials, slowly and patiently preparing for a day he wasn't sure would ever come. He had heard the car arrive. He had heard their voices. When he heard Chloe speak his name, he thought he was losing his mind. Then he heard the thugs arrive, and he knew this was his only chance. "He kept me alive," Hank said, his voice filled with a cold, simmering rage. "Because he knew that if he killed me, and the truth ever came out, he'd be a murderer. This way he was just a man who had to commit his unstable partner. It was all a contingency, a sick, twisted insurance policy." Back at David's apartment, the atmosphere was electric. The whiteboard was no longer about a ghost. It was about a living, breathing victim. They had the ultimate proof, but they were also in more danger than ever. Hayes thought he was just cleaning up a loose end, a reporter and a fired maid. Now he would know that his entire world was about to come crashing down. He would stop at nothing to find them, to silence all of them for good. "We can't go to the police," David said, pacing his small apartment. "Not yet. Hayes owns half the city officials. He'll have the report buried, and we'll be labeled as fugitives or lunatics. We have one shot at this. We have to go public. But we need to do it in a way he can't control. Hank, looking stronger and more lucid after a hot meal, looked at the board. There's a vulnerability, he said, his engineer's mind clicking back into gear. Preston's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. His ego. His public image. He pointed to a date on the calendar that David had circled. In 3 days, Hayes Industries was holding its annual gala, a massive media event where Preston Hayes would unveil the company's new 5-year plan. It would be broadcast live. Hundreds of journalists, investors, and politicians would be there. He loves the spotlight, Hank said, a grim smile on his face. Let's give him a show he'll never forget. The plan was audacious. It was dangerous. It was borderline insane. It was perfect. They would crash the gala. They would use David's press credentials to get him inside. Jessica and Chloe would come as his guests. Hank would have to stay hidden. He was their ace in the hole. The next 2 days were a frantic blur of preparation. David called in every favor he was owed, securing a camera from a sympathetic freelance journalist and an interview slot on a small, independent online news stream that would be covering the event. It wasn't a major network, but it was a platform. Jessica, meanwhile, took Hank to a small, discreet clinic run by a doctor who had once been a source for David. The doctor confirmed that Hank was severely malnourished and suffering from muscle atrophy, but he was physically stable. He documented everything, another piece of evidence for their arsenal. As the night of the gala arrived, a tense silence fell over the small apartment. David was in a slightly too tight suit he hadn't worn in 6 years. Jessica wore a simple black dress, her face a mask of calm resolve. Chloe, in a dress her mother had bought from a thrift store, clutched a small, worn photograph of her grandfather in his army uniform. "Are you ready for this, little star?" Hank asked her, his voice now strong and clear. Chloe looked up at him, at the real, living grandfather who had been returned to her. She nodded, her blue eyes shining with a fierce light. "For you, Granddad," she said. "Always." The ballroom of the Hayes Plaza Hotel was a universe of crystal and champagne. David, Jessica, and Chloe slipped in through a side entrance, their press passes a flimsy key to the kingdom. They found a spot near the back, partially obscured by a large marble pillar, with a clear view of the stage. The tension was a living thing, a knot tightening in Jessica's stomach. "Remember the plan," David whispered. "When he starts talking about this spark of inspiration, that's my cue." Finally, the moment arrived. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the stage. Preston Hayes walked out to thunderous applause, the king in his castle, untouchable and supreme. He began his speech, weaving a grand narrative of his own genius. "It all started," he said, his voice resonating with false humility, "with a single drawing. A moment of inspiration, a dream that I sketched out on paper, a dream that would become the Odyssey engine and change the world. This was the signal." David pushed his way forward. "Mr. Hayes," he called out. "David Chun. A question about your original partner. A man you erased from your history. Henry Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. Hayes's eyes found David, and his smile became a tight, dangerous line. "I'm not taking questions, Mr. Chun. But this question is about the dissolution agreement you forged." Jessica's voice, clear and strong, rang out from the back of the room. She stepped forward, holding the notarized affidavit. "Is that why you had him declared dead after he disappeared?" The room erupted in a chaotic buzz. Preston Hayes looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his face a mask of fury and panic projected onto the massive screens beside the stage. "Security," Hayes roared. "Get that woman out of here. This is pathetic extortion." The guards surged towards Jessica, but a small figure darted out in front of them. It was Chloe. She stood before the stage and held up the worn photograph of her grandfather in his army uniform. Her voice was small, but in the shocked silence, it carried the weight of a decade of injustice. "This is my granddad," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He was a hero. You didn't just steal his signature," she said, looking straight at Preston Hayes. "You stole my granddad. Where is he? What did you do to my granddad?" The question, so simple and pure, was a cannonball that shattered Hayes's entire world. There was no spin, no denial that could contain the raw power of that moment. Hayes was trapped, speechless, a cornered animal exposed for the world to see. And then came the final, devastating blow. The large double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Framed in the doorway, supported by a cane but standing tall, was Henry Hank Miller. He was a ghost made flesh, a living testament to the monstrous lie. A collective gasp went through the audience as he began to walk slowly, deliberately, towards the stage. Every tap of his cane on the marble floor was a beat in a funeral dirge for Preston Hayes. He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at the man who had been his friend, his partner, and his jailer. "It's over, Preston," Hank said, his voice raspy but imbued with an unbreakable authority. "The truth is out." Preston Hayes looked from Hank's face to Chloe's, to the sea of cameras broadcasting his ruin. The mask of the Titan finally crumbled, revealing the pathetic, terrified man underneath. He stumbled back from the podium, his empire of lies collapsing around him in a silent, deafening roar. Epilogue, 6 months later. The downfall of Preston Hayes was swift and absolute. Arrested that night, he was convicted of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and corporate fraud. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. From the ashes of his empire, Miller Legacy Innovations was born. The patents for the Odyssey engine were rightfully returned to Hank Miller, who, with his health slowly improving, took his place as the head of research and development. He was finally free to guide his inventions toward the benevolent future he had always dreamed of. The new CEO was his daughter, Jessica. She had traded her maid's uniform for a business suit, leading the new company with a fierce determination and an unwavering moral compass. David Chin's career was resurrected. His exposé won him a Pulitzer Prize, transforming him from a disgraced reporter into a celebrated hero of investigative journalism. He launched a nonprofit foundation to fund the kind of fearless reporting that holds the powerful accountable. And Chloe, the little girl whose brave question had brought down a Titan, was finally just a girl again. She spent her weekends in the lab with her grandfather, her sketchbook now filled not just with birds, but with new ideas for inventions, her mind, like his, filled with dreams of a better world. One sunny afternoon, she stood with her mother and grandfather on the observation deck of the new Miller Legacy building, looking out over the city. The future, once a terrifying unknown, now stretched out before them, bright and full of promise. "You know, Granddad," Chloe said, slipping her hand into his. "Your signature is my favorite thing to draw." Hank smiled, a real, brilliant smile that reached his eyes, finally free of the shadows. "I know, little star," he said, squeezing her hand. "Let's go give them something new to write about." And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.